So thank you so much for being here. And for those who don't know you, John, can you introduce yourself so people can know who you are?
Yeah, I'm a PhD student in muscle metabolism. So our lab investigates mostly how with nutrition and exercise you can keep muscles healthy. This we do this in a variety of populations. This can be how do we keep the elderly fit? How do we get people who end up in the hospital? How do we get them fit out of the hospital? But then my interest and of a few other guys here is mostly athletes. So how do we improve performance in athletes? How do they recover faster? How do they build more muscle? Stuff like that. So I would say the majority of our research is on protein supplementation. How with protein, athletes get bigger, stronger, faster. But we also do some research into carbohydrate metabolism. So what should endurance athletes eat after a race, for example?
All right, excellent. If I may sum it up, anything related to muscle protein synthesis, you're kind of an expert in this field. It can be for elderly people, athletes, so that's something you're really into. Okay, so I have a few questions for you. My first question would be, how could you, in general, optimize protein distribution, and how does it relate to muscle protein synthesis? So if you can talk about this.
Yeah, so the basic summary of muscle protein synthesis is that I always like to give the example that your muscle is like a wall, and then on one side, bricks are being added to the wall, and then the process of adding those bricks is called muscle protein synthesis. So muscle protein synthesis makes the wall, your muscles bigger. However, at the same time, there's an opposing process. So walls are being removed. Bricks are being removed from the wall. That's called muscle protein breakdown. However, the speed at which those bricks are being removed from the wall, it's always more or less the same. So muscle protein synthesis can drastically increase during a day, and by increasing muscle protein synthesis, you can make your muscles bigger. Now, there's two main stimuli for muscle protein synthesis. That's exercise, so going to the gym, for example, and uh, eating, and then mostly protein. Now, not all protein is the same. There's like three main variables that determine how well protein stimulates muscle protein synthesis. That's obviously how much protein you eat, the quality of the protein. For example, should you eat a steak, so animal protein, or uh, a soy drink, for example, plant-based protein, and then we see that animal-based protein is usually a little bit better. And the third variable is when you eat it and how you distribute it throughout the day. So there is some research that suggests that's a little bit more effective to spread it out throughout the day than having everything in just one or two big meals.
Okay, excellent. You mentioned these 3 points as a really general takeaway: the quantity, the quality, and also at what time and how many times. Just a basic suggestion: what would it be for? Let's say, let's just take your example. If you would like to optimize muscle protein synthesis, you train 3, 4 times per week, and well, how would you do this?
Yeah, so um, let's start with how much should you eat. In the field, we like to express protein needs on a per meal basis. So that means we don't really necessarily give recommendations like you should eat that much in a day, because I already mentioned that when you eat can also influence the result. So you cannot really see those two separately. And then we know that about 20 grams of protein gives a near maximal effect on muscle protein synthesis. Now, if you go up to 40 gram, you see that muscle protein synthesis goes up by about 10 to 20 additional percents. So depends a little bit on you personally if you think that's worth the effort. So if you're just a regular gym goer and you have 3 to 4 meals with 20 gram of protein, that's pretty solid. On the other hand, if you're a competing athlete, I would recommend try to hit at least 40 grams of protein in each meal, because the results will likely be slightly better. Also pretty interesting is that recently a study came out. It was the first study where you quite clearly saw that 40 gram did it better than 20 gram. So that's the study where the 40 gram was 20% better. And the authors think that the reason was that it was the first study in which the subjects did a whole body resistance training. So they think if you train more muscle mass, then you will need a little bit more protein. And that sounds quite logical. Not necessarily as logical as it seems, because in the same study they found that bigger guys didn't need more protein than smaller guys. So not everything that instinctively seems correct always appears to be correct. But still, based on that study, if you do very intensive training, so if you do maybe train arms, then perhaps 20 grams is enough. If you do a whole body routine, I would definitely try to hit at least 40 grams in each meal. And again, if you're a serious athlete, there's really no reason not to go up to 40 grams. So I would try to hit at least 40 grams of 20 to 40 grams during the 3 main meals. So breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And that should optimize muscle protein synthesis during most of the day. However, for a lot of people, dinner is their last big meal of the day, and afterwards they don't really eat for 10 to 12 hours until it's breakfast again. And our group has done some research that suggests that it might be a good idea to add a fourth meal prior to sleep. Now, this is a bit of a cultural thing. So if in your culture, there are some cultures where people have like a huge dinner just an hour before they go to bed, well, that's more or less the same as pre-sleep protein supplementation. So basically those 3 to 4 meals, you have to distribute them in a way that makes the most sense for you. Same for people who skip breakfast. Adding some supplemental protein at breakfast can be very beneficial for those people. So in general, my recommendation is, the most basic recommendation is try to hit at least 120 grams of protein a day. Ideally, quite a bit of that from animal sources, which is a little bit more effective. And then after that, try to, if you want to optimize your results, try to distribute it in 3 to ideally 4 to 5 meals with each 30 to 40 grams of protein.
All right, excellent. Thank you. Just one specific question about this. You tend to give recommendations more about how much protein per meal you should get and how to spread it, and not with the total normalized by body weight or lean body mass, for example. Can you just say something? What's your take on this?
Yeah, so there's only one study that has directly investigated, where they had 2 groups, one group with bigger dudes, so who had more lean body mass, and one group with a smaller amount of lean body mass. And they saw that those 2 groups responded exactly the same to protein. So you would think that if you give 20 grams of protein, maybe for a smaller guy, that's more than enough. But that the bigger guy, that's just suboptimal, right? Just as that a bigger guy needs more calories. But that didn't really seem to be the case. Regardless of size, people responded exactly the same. Now that's likely related to that people, of course, think of the analogy that I used earlier, that protein are the bricks for muscle growth. But protein is not just the building block for muscle. Protein is actually a signal for muscle growth. And the amount of protein you need to optimize that signal is much higher than how much bricks you need. So if you just had 10 grams of protein, you already have more than enough bricks to build muscle, but you need more protein basically to tell your muscle, let's actually start using those bricks. So I think that's why there's a difference um, between what we feel instinctively and the results we see in the study.
Okay, pretty much like a trigger or something, and then
Yeah, exactly,
okay,
exactly.
excellent.
So one analogy I've once heard is that uh, the protein, the trigger, that's like the boss at work that tells you get to work, and the boss only gets motivated at high amounts of protein, while a small amount of protein already gives enough bricks, right?
Okay, excellent. I'll remember this one. Perfect. So, also one of the subject I wanted to develop with you was glycogen. People are usually really interested in glycogen also, specifically when we talk about nutrient timing. They think, especially around the workout, for example, they should optimize glycogen repletion. Uh, well, basically, I would like to know what's your take on this in general, and for who it's really like relevant or useful or is even necessary. So yeah, can you talk about glycogen?
Yeah, so I'll quickly go back to the protein because there you have the same concept where some people suggest that you should make sure that you have your protein shake immediately after exercise to get the maximal effect. They also call it nutrient timing. And while it's true that there's a synergy between exercise and protein, you use more of your protein if you have done exercise before it. Um, it isn't really like an on-off switch. So for about at least 24 hours and likely up to 48, 72 hours after resistance exercise, you respond better to your protein. So it's not really a matter of, oh, I need to have that shake immediately after exercise, as long as you make sure that throughout the day after exercise, you get your protein, you're solid. And if you follow the protein distribution recommendations, you likely always have protein around your workout because either it's after your workout or you still have some protein in your system from a meal before your workout. Now, with carbohydrates and endurance exercise, it's a little bit different because there is a real, what we call the window of opportunity, that if you eat carbohydrates after endurance training, um, muscle glycogen repletion is much faster than if you wait a few hours before you eat some carbohydrates. So if you want the fastest possible recovery, and then based on muscle glycogen, you should definitely eat carbohydrates as soon as possible after your workout. Um, then the question becomes, for who is this relevant? So if we start again with resistance training, well, muscle glycogen is not that relevant. First of all, for example, our lab has done a study where we did a relatively high volume, 16 sets of leg exercises, and that only depleted muscle glycogen for about 30%. So even if you do a very high volume training, you won't really deplete all that much glycogen. It will never really become limiting. And especially if you do that type of, if you do 16 sets of legs today, you're definitely not going to hit your legs tomorrow again. So fast muscle glycogen repletion is not really that relevant for resistance training. The only people who train high frequency, those train with lower volumes anyway, and it's very likely that those muscle glycogen stores will be repleted in 24 hours if you just did like 1 to 5 sets anyway. For endurance athletes, it's a little bit different. For example, think of Tour de France, where you're cycling most of the day, and you have just a few hours to eat, and then you have to sleep, and then next day you have to perform again. For them, it's absolutely critical to rebuild their muscle glycogen as fast as possible because they only have a very short recovery window. Um, and well, luckily, carbohydrate supplementation is very effective. So you should eat about 60 grams of carbohydrates each hour. Your gut cannot really absorb more carbohydrates, more than 60 grams per hour. So you can try to eat more, but that doesn't really work. All that happens is it stays in your stomach and you'll just get sick. However, we have done some research in recent years that shows that if you have different type of carbohydrates, they are absorbed via different mechanisms in the gut. So basically, you got an entrance in the gut for males and one for females. So if you try to enter the gut with men's and females, it is faster than when the same amount of people who are just males try to go through the one door, right? So we call this multiple transportable carbohydrates. And then you have two types. You have glucose, which is basically the main carbohydrate in the diet, and you have fructose. And these use different transporters. So we have shown that if you have combination of these two carbohydrates, you can absorb carbohydrates at a higher rate. And therefore you can rebuild glycogen faster. But it's not entirely that simple. It now sounds, just have a carbohydrate mix and then more carbohydrates will be absorbed so I recover faster. But the fructose, it is absorbed in the gut, but then it goes to the liver. But the liver doesn't release the fructose. So the fructose gets converted to lactate. And lactate has a very bad reputation. People think it's responsible for the burning feeling of exercise, but that's actually not true. Lactate doesn't cause that burning sensation and doesn't cause fatigue. However, lactate cannot be used to rebuild muscle glycogen. So if you add fructose to glucose, you do absorb more carbohydrates, but those extra carbohydrates, you cannot use it to rebuild muscle glycogen. However, as I said, the fructose is still absorbed and transported to the liver. Some part is transformed into lactate, but the other part is transformed in liver glycogen. So by adding fructose, still your liver is recovering faster. So it's still beneficial to have that mixture of carbohydrates. So the protocol that we now know is more or less the best we have at this point in time is about 60 grams of glucose, maybe a little bit higher if you're bigger. There is some research in contrast to the protein that bigger guys can absorb a little bit more glucose, and then add about 20 grams of fructose to replete your liver a little bit faster.
Excellent. Thank you very much for this. So this difference, so could you normalize this time carbohydrates in the lean body mass or in the body weight more than you should? So yeah, for protein.
Yeah. So the guidelines for optimal muscle glycogen repletion are 1.2 grams of glucose per kilogram of body weight. It's not based on lean body mass, which you might think makes more sense, right? Because you think, well, if you have more muscle, then you need more carbohydrates. But it's actually based on if you're bigger. So if your body weight is bigger, you have a bigger gut, and therefore you can absorb the carbohydrates faster in your gut. So it's more based on that bigger guys have a bigger gut than based on the amount of muscle mass you have. So it's about 1.2 grams of glucose per minute, and then you would add a maximum of 0.3 grams of fructose to make sure that your liver recovers as fast as possible as well.
All right, excellent. Thank you very much.
Maybe one thing that's important to say is those carbohydrate intakes are very high, and for people who are not used to that, it's not a good idea. You should slowly work up to it because you can more or less train your gut to get better at absorbing carbohydrates. So your gut has to get used to it a little bit. Then the other thing that's important to say is there is some research that suggests that if you eat a lot of carbohydrates directly after endurance training, your body more or less gets lazy, and the training adaptation is a little bit less. So it's often suggested that um, you should not always eat carbohydrates immediately after a training session, where the goal is to get as much as possible out of the training session. But if your goal is to recover as fast as possible, for example, if you have a new event later in the day or the next day, then you should eat carbohydrates. So it's not necessarily that post-exercise carbohydrates are always beneficial. It depends a little bit on the context.
All right, excellent. Thank you very much. So the difference between a guy seeking performance in short term or long term adaptations would be a different strategies also for
Yes,
this.
exactly.
Excellent. All right. And so if I talk about a hardcore bodybuilder who would like to train for a really, really high volume and they do a split workout and they even want to train 2 times per day, would there in this case be relevant to talk about glycogen or even for this type of hardcore profile? Not even close.
Um, well, so the when I mentioned that carbohydrates might reduce training adaptations, that's only relevant for endurance training,
Okay.
because basically with endurance training, one of the main things you're doing is learning your body to become better at burning fat as fuel. And when you give carbohydrates right away after training, your body knows like, oh, there will always be carbohydrates, so I don't really have to adapt to burning fat that much. However, for resistance training, there's absolutely no problem with eating carbohydrates after your training. So yeah, so for a serious bodybuilder, they can basically eat as many carbohydrates as they want, as long as they don't get fat. So yeah, for a high volume, high frequency bodybuilder, yeah, they should definitely eat a good amount of carbs.
All right, but based on the whole day to make sure they can keep going according to their calorie intake.
Exactly.
Okay, excellent. Perfect. So, well, that was very clear, at least for me. I hope it's going to be for everyone, but I think it was. Thank you. Do you have anything that you would like to add on I don't know, a fresh topic or a myth that is hanging around and you would like to to talk about this one or
Oh man, there's so many myths. Let's see what.
just pick one, maybe your favorite, a couple of your favorite ones,
Um,
or just one of your articles. They talk about many.
yeah, it's hard to say this. Pooh. I know. Ask me a specific question. Give me a bro myth, and I'll tell you what I think about it. Let's do it like
Perfect. One of my favorite one would be probably you should for body composition and to optimize muscle protein synthesis, etc. You absolutely don't want to eat carbs after 6. That's really a typical one. Is it true? Is it not? Why would it be wrong? Why would it be right?
yeah. So that's again something where people go by their instinct, and your instinct says like after 6 you just lay on the couch a little bit, you watch some television, and then you're going to bed, so your body isn't really doing anything. So if you give it a lot of fuel, if you give a lot of carbohydrates, it's going to store everything as fat. um, but it doesn't really work like that. So it's much more about the daily balance of calories. So if you hardly eat any calories of carbohydrates during the day, that just means that your glycogen stores are not fully filled. So if you then would eat a lot of carbohydrates late at night, uh, they're not going into your fat stores. They're going to fill up your glycogen stores first, right? Alternatively, if you would eat a lot of carbohydrates early in the day, Um, that just means that you don't have any space later in the day. But it's really about that daily balance. Your body doesn't have a clock where it says, "Oh, yeah, it's now sleep time, so I'm not going to work anymore, so I'll just store it as fat." So
Perfect
this
way.
maybe if we then talk about myths, is that the biggest myth ever is that you can hack your body. So basically, any theory that is like, oh, if you just avoid insulin or if you just avoid this food, then you hack the body and this happens. Like basically, our body is millions of years of evolution of basically anti-hacks. Our body is made so that we cannot trick it, because otherwise we would have died in evolution. If it was just a trick with insulin, everyone would die who ever not have some carbohydrates in their diet. So our body is millions of years of evolution to not starve, and every theory that suggests that you can hack it, uh, yeah,
Yeah.
they need to read the evolution theory.
Yeah, sure. Okay. All right, thank you very much. I wanted to talk about the insulin model of obesity as well, which, well, I completely agree. Anything that simplifies everything to just one bad thing, just
Exactly.
it cannot be right. It's
Well,
impossible.
the thing is, the problem is, I don't know if half of the people who make those claims believe them, but the thing is, it's very difficult to sell a book that says you need to eat less, train harder, do especially squats, like the super hard exercise, only eat these very boring veggies. Like, who's gonna buy that book, right?
Yeah, sure.
So if you market a hack, you give people hope, and that's the problem that yeah, a lot of people fall for the marketing because they know they cannot put in the effort they need to put in, so they they want that result so badly that they just more or less choose to believe, oh, we can hack the body. But unfortunately, yeah, basically the what I always say, that here the long road is the short road, because you can try 20 hacks in 20 years and you'll only be in worse shape. While if you just try to do some effort, so eat a little bit cleaner, train at least a little bit over the years, you will improve. So doing the hard thing is the only road to success.
Excellent. So it would be
Very depressive message for other people.
it's well, it's the most important one anyway, because you can see everywhere on YouTube, like the three best hacks for your health, for your muscle, for your whatever you want. And if you watch how many times these videos are used, it's just crazy how this goes. It's just they're better than us at giving a message. So we should be able to do something like the three best scientific evidence to something and try to be as good as they are. But yeah, I'm glad that you put it this way, because yeah, we want it's a no, sorry for the word, no BS video, and that's why I thank you so much for the quality of this content. All right, well.